The applause inside the grand marble lobby died so suddenly that even the clicking of expensive dress shoes echoed across the room. Every executive seated around the polished boardroom table stared at the quiet man walking through the open doors in a simple navy suit, holding nothing but a thin leather folder. Just 12 months earlier, security had escorted him out of this very building as employees watched with pity and customers pretended not to notice. The bank manager who had publicly laughed at his desperate request for a $5,000 loan now stood frozen, unable to breathe as the chairman smiled warmly, extended his hand, and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the new majority owner of this bank." No one could understand how the broken single father they had dismissed had returned with the power to decide every one of their futures. But the answer had begun long before anyone inside that room had learned the true value of a man who refused to quit. Daniel Reyes had never dreamed of becoming wealthy. He had dreamed of something far simpler, a peaceful life where his 10-year-old son, Ethan, never had to wonder whether the lights would stay on or whether dinner would be enough to fill his stomach. Ever since Daniel's wife had passed away after a sudden illness 3 years earlier, every morning began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. He repaired machinery at a small manufacturing company during the day, drove for delivery apps at night, and spent every remaining minute helping Ethan with homework before the boy drifted asleep on the worn-out couch that had become their family movie theater, dining room, and sometimes Daniel's own bed. Their apartment was tiny, their clothes were modest, and their savings account rarely held more than a few $100s. But every evening Daniel smiled as though he owned the world because Ethan still believed his father could solve any problem. Hidden beneath Daniel's exhausting routine was an idea he had spent nearly 6 years developing in notebooks stained with grease and coffee. Working around industrial equipment had shown him countless ways companies wasted electricity, and he believed he had designed a compact energy optimization device capable of reducing factory power consumption by nearly 40%. He had tested crude prototypes using discarded machine parts collected from junkyards, and every successful experiment convinced him he was closer to building something that could change thousands of businesses. The problem was painfully simple. His final prototype required specialized components costing just under $5,000. Investors refused to meet unknown mechanics. Friends had already helped as much as they could, and Daniel had sold nearly everything valuable he owned. The bank seemed like his final chance. $5,000 was all that stood between another struggling father and an invention that might finally give his son the future he deserved. Walking into the elegant headquarters of Silvercrest Bank, Daniel carried more hope than fear. He wore his cleanest shirt, carefully ironed the night before, and carried detailed blueprints, financial projections, patent paperwork, and years of research organized inside a worn folder. He wasn't asking for charity. He wanted a small business loan backed by a repayment plan based on future licensing agreements. Every figure had been calculated repeatedly. Every page represented years of sacrifice. He imagined returning home that evening to tell Ethan they finally had a chance. The thought alone made the exhausting weeks of preparation worthwhile. The loan officer barely glanced at the documents before forwarding Daniel to the branch manager, Richard Holloway, a man known throughout the bank for valuing appearances almost as much as numbers. Richard studied Daniel's patched shoes longer than he studied the business proposal. Instead of asking questions about the invention, he asked why someone with Daniel's income believed he deserved financing. Daniel answered honestly, explaining his work history, his invention, and the opportunities it could create. Richard leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and chuckled loud enough for employees outside the office to hear. "Mr. Reyes," he said with a smirk, "banks finance businesses, not dreams sketched by mechanics who can't even maintain a respectable savings account." The words stung, but Daniel remained calm. He politely requested that Richard at least review the engineering reports. Richard never opened the folder. The humiliation grew worse when Richard called for security under the excuse that Daniel had become argumentative, even though he had done nothing more than plead for a fair review. Customers in the lobby turned to watch as two guards politely escorted him toward the exit. Ethan, who had waited patiently in a chair reading a library book, looked at his father with frightened eyes that Daniel would never forget. Outside the building, Ethan quietly asked, "Does this mean your invention wasn't good enough?" Daniel knelt beside his son, forced a smile despite the lump in his throat, and answered, "No, buddy. It just means the wrong people looked at it." As they walked away beneath cold gray skies, Richard watched from the second-floor window, convinced he had just avoided approving another hopeless loan application. He had no idea he had rejected the greatest opportunity the bank would ever see. The weeks that followed tested Daniel more severely than any period of his life. Bills accumulated faster than income. The landlord issued late payment notices. Ethan needed new glasses after his old pair cracked during gym class, and Daniel quietly skipped meals so his son could have them. Every setback whispered that perhaps the bank manager had been right, that maybe ordinary people weren't supposed to build extraordinary things. Yet every evening after Ethan fell asleep, Daniel returned to his workbench inside the apartment storage room and continued refining his design using salvaged components. He reminded himself that quitting would guarantee failure, while persistence at least left room for possibility. Everything changed because of an accident that almost seemed insignificant. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel helped an elderly stranger restart a disabled delivery truck outside a community center. The grateful man introduced himself as Victor Langston, a retired industrial engineer who had spent decades consulting for global manufacturing companies. During casual conversation, Victor noticed technical sketches sticking out of Daniel's backpack and asked about them. Most people dismissed the drawings within seconds, but Victor studied them carefully, asking increasingly detailed engineering questions. 2 hours later, the elderly engineer looked at Daniel with disbelief and quietly said, "Do you realize what you've built?" Daniel admitted he wasn't certain anyone else would ever believe in it. Victor smiled. "I do." Victor introduced Daniel to former colleagues who specialized in clean energy manufacturing technologies. Unlike the bank manager, these professionals judged the invention rather than the inventor. Independent testing confirmed that Daniel's device exceeded expectations, lowering industrial electricity costs even more efficiently than early projections predicted. Within months, venture capital firms competed to fund commercialization. Patent approvals moved quickly, licensing contracts multiplied, and manufacturers eager to reduce energy expenses signed agreements worth millions. Daniel never became wealthy overnight. He became successful because years of invisible work suddenly met people wise enough to recognize its value. 1 year after being escorted out of Silvercrest Bank, financial newspapers shocked the business world by reporting that a major investment consortium had begun purchasing large amounts of the bank's declining stock. Poor executive decisions, risky commercial lending, and shrinking customer confidence had driven the institution into serious financial trouble. Few people knew that the consortium's largest investor was Daniel Reyes. Rather than seeking luxury cars or extravagant mansions, Daniel saw an opportunity to rebuild an institution that had forgotten its responsibility to serve hardworking people. Quietly and legally, he acquired enough shares to become the majority owner. Richard Holloway never expected to see Daniel again until the day every executive received an emergency notice requiring attendance at a special board meeting. He walked confidently into the boardroom, assuming another restructuring discussion awaited him. Instead, he saw Daniel seated calmly beside the chairman. The same humble expression remained on Daniel's face, but the fear was gone. Richard's confidence evaporated instantly. The chairman formally announced the ownership transition before inviting Daniel to address the room. Silence settled over every executive as Daniel slowly stood. "I've imagined this moment many times," Daniel began. "Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted understanding. 12 months ago, I entered this bank asking for $5,000 backed by research, patents, projections, and determination. I left believing that my appearance mattered more than my character. My son watched adults teach him that poverty deserves humiliation instead of opportunity. That lesson nearly destroyed his faith in people." Daniel paused as several executives lowered their eyes. Fortunately, other people evaluated my ideas instead of my shoes. Richard finally found the courage to speak. His voice trembled. "Mr. Reyes, I made a mistake." Daniel nodded gently. "Yes, you did. But your greatest mistake wasn't rejecting my loan. Banks reject applications every day. Your greatest mistake was forgetting that every application belongs to a human being carrying responsibilities you may never understand." The words landed harder than any insult could have. Daniel announced immediate leadership changes, ethical lending reforms, blind application reviews for small business loans, and mandatory customer respect training across every branch. Richard was relieved of his managerial position, not because Daniel hated him, but because leadership without compassion had already cost the institution far too much. News of the transformation spread rapidly. Small business owners who had once feared entering Silvercrest Bank now found advisors willing to listen before judging. Young entrepreneurs received mentorship programs alongside financing opportunities. Employees were encouraged to reward integrity instead of appearances, and customer satisfaction steadily climbed. Daniel often visited local branches quietly, without cameras or media coverage, sitting beside nervous applicants to remind them that everyone deserves to be heard. Whenever reporters asked why he hadn't publicly humiliated Richard the way Richard had humiliated him, Daniel simply answered, "Justice changes systems. Revenge only changes headlines." At home, life looked wonderfully ordinary. Ethan finally had his own bedroom, shelves filled with books, and a backyard where he could chase their adopted golden retriever every afternoon. Yet Daniel insisted that very little else change. They still ate dinner together every evening. They still volunteered at community workshops helping aspiring inventors build prototypes from recycled materials. Above Daniel's desk rested the worn leather folder containing the original rejected loan application. He never displayed it as a trophy. He kept it as a reminder that the world often measures people by temporary circumstances, while true potential quietly waits beneath the surface, needing only one person willing to believe. If this story reminded you that today's rejection does not define tomorrow's victory, then remember Daniel Reyes. Whenever life tells you that your dreams are too small, your resources are too limited, or your background is too ordinary. Sometimes the door that closes isn't the end of your journey. It simply pushes you toward the path that was always meant for you. And if you enjoy inspiring stories of resilience, unexpected justice, and unforgettable underdogs rising against impossible odds, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today, and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were Daniel standing inside that boardroom?